The bar was a haze of neon and regret. The kind of place where dreams went to drown in cheap whiskey. I was 23, broke, and stupid enough to say yes when my best friend, Caleb, slid a crumpled $100 bill across the sticky counter. "Flirt with my dad, Eli," he'd said, his grin sharp enough to cut glass. It sounded like a prank. A dumb bet born from too many beers and Caleb's knack for chaos. His dad, Mark, was a 45-year-old contractor, broad shoulders, calloused hands, and the kind of straight guy energy that screamed, "I don't get it, and I don't want to." Caleb swore it'd be hilarious, a way to mess with his old man's head. "He's so uptight," Caleb said, laughing. "Just bat your eyes, charm him a bit, and watch him squirm. Easy money." I needed the cash, rent was due, and my barista gig wasn't cutting it. So I agreed, thinking it'd be a quick laugh. What could go wrong? I met Mark the next day at their family's annual barbecue in suburban Virginia, the air thick with charcoal smoke and summer heat. Caleb's backyard was a postcard of Americana, kids running through sprinklers, neighbors clutching red Solo cups, and Mark at the grill, flipping burgers like he was born for it. He was taller than I'd imagined, with dark hair graying at the temples and a jawline that could have been carved from oak. His blue eyes flicked toward me when Caleb introduced us, and I felt a jolt like I'd touched a live wire. "Eli, right?" Mark's voice was low, steady, like he was sizing me up. I nodded, my throat suddenly dry, and flashed a smile I'd perfected in the mirror, cocky enough to charm, soft enough to disarm. "Heard you're good with words," he said, turning back to the grill. "Was that a challenge?" I leaned against the picnic table, closer than necessary, and said, "Only when I've got someone worth talking to." His head snapped up, and for a split second, his eyes locked on mine. Something flickered their surprise. Maybe. Or something heavier. Then he laughed, brushing it off, and I wondered if I'd imagined it. Caleb was watching from across the yard, smirking like he'd won the lottery. I played along, keeping it light. I complimented Mark's grilling skills, asked about his work, let my hand brush his when I passed him a beer. Each time, he'd pause, just for a heartbeat, before responding with a gruff joke or a change of subject. But I noticed the way his fingers tightened around his bottle, the way his gaze lingered when he thought I wasn't looking. This wasn't just a game anymore. Something was shifting, and it scared me as much as it thrilled me. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I was in too deep. Caleb pulled me aside, grinning. "You're killing it, man." Dad's so confused. "It's perfect." He slipped me another 50, but the money felt dirty in my pocket. I wasn't just flirting for a paycheck anymore. I was flirting because I wanted to, cause Mark's quiet intensity was pulling me in like a riptide. And that was dangerous. That night, I lay awake in my tiny apartment, replaying every glance, every word. Mark wasn't just some straight dad. There was something unspoken in him, something buried under years of routine and responsibility. I didn't know what it was, but I wanted to find out. The problem was, Caleb was my best friend, and this was supposed to be a joke. If I crossed that line, there'd be no going back. The next week, Caleb texted me, "Round 2. Saturday. Dad's fixing the deck. Keep it going." I should have said no. I should have returned the money and walked away. But I didn't. Instead, I showed up at their house, heart pounding, wearing a fitted t-shirt and a smile that felt more like a confession. Mark was in the backyard, shirtless under the July sun, hammering nails into the deck with a focus that made my mouth go dry. "Need a hand?" I asked, stepping closer. He looked up, sweat glistening on his skin, and for the first time, he didn't look away. "Careful," he said, his voice rough. "You might get more than you bargained for." I laughed, but my pulse was racing. This wasn't about Caleb's bet anymore. This was about us two people standing on the edge of something neither of us could name. And I had no idea how to stop. The deck was half finished, a skeleton of wood and nails baking under the Virginia sun. Mark wiped his brow, his movements deliberate, like he was trying to anchor himself to the task. I stood there, holding a spare plank, feeling like an idiot for thinking I could play this game without getting burned. "You're not much of a carpenter," Mark said, glancing at my clumsy grip on the wood. His tone was teasing, but his eyes were searching, like he was trying to figure out what I was really doing here. I shrugged, leaning against the railing, letting my shirt ride up just enough to catch his attention. "I've got other skills," I said, keeping my voice light but loaded. His jaw tightened, and he turned back to his hammer, but not before I caught the flush creeping up his neck. Caleb was inside, blasting music and scrolling through his phone, oblivious to the tension coiling in the backyard. I should have kept it simple, toss a few flirty lines, collect my cash, and leave. But every time Mark's gaze met mine, it felt like a dare. I handed him a nail, my fingers brushing his, and he froze for a split second, his breath catching. "Your trouble," he muttered, almost to himself. I grinned, leaning closer. "Only the good kind." The day stretched on, and the flirting became a dance careful, electric, dangerous. I'd ask about his life, his work, his past, and he'd answer in short bursts, like he was guarding something. But the more we talked, the more I saw cracks in his armor. He mentioned his divorce 5 years ago, how Caleb's mom had left for someone less complicated. He laughed it off, but there was a weight to it, a loneliness that hit me harder than I expected. I wanted to reach out, not just for the bet, but because I saw something in him, a man who'd spent years building walls instead of bridges. By late afternoon, we were sitting on the unfinished deck, sharing a beer and a silence that felt heavier than words. "Why do you keep coming around?" he asked suddenly, his voice low, like he was afraid of the answer. I could have lied, played it off as just hanging with Caleb. But I didn't. "Because I like talking to you," I said, meeting his eyes. His expression shifted surprise, maybe fear, but also something softer. He looked away, staring at the horizon, and I wondered what he was seeing that I couldn't. That night, Caleb cornered me in the kitchen. "You're too good at this," he said, laughing, but there was an edge to it. "Dad's acting weird. You're not actually into him, right?" My stomach dropped. I forced a laugh, shaking my head, but the lie tasted bitter. Caleb didn't notice he was too busy planning the next prank. But I was starting to realize this wasn't a game anymore. Not for me. And maybe not for Mark either. The next time I saw Mark, it was at a local diner. A last-minute invite from Caleb to keep the joke going. Mark was already there, sitting in a booth, his flannel shirt rolled up to his elbows. He looked tired, but when he saw me, His face lit up just for a moment. Before he caught himself, I slid into the booth across from him, and Caleb made some excuse to leave us alone, winking at me as he went. "Traitor. You're persistent," Mark said, stirring his coffee. I leaned forward, elbows on the table, and said, "Maybe I just like the company." He didn't laugh this time. He looked at me, really looked, and I felt the air shift. "You don't know what you're starting," he said quietly, but there was no warning in his tone, only want. My heart pounded, and I knew I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. But I didn't care. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting Mark's face in sharp relief. He was still holding his coffee mug, knuckles white, like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. I wanted to reach across the table, to touch his hand, to see if the spark I felt was real or just my imagination running wild. "You're not like Caleb's other friends," he said, his voice careful, like he was stepping onto thin ice. I tilted my head, smirking. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? He didn't answer right away, just studied me, his blue eyes narrowing slightly. "Depends on what you're after," he said finally, and the weight of those words hit me like a punch. He knew something was up, not the bet. Maybe. But the way I kept pushing, kept getting closer, and he wasn't pulling away. We talked for hours, long after Caleb texted that he'd be back later. Mark opened up about his life, how he'd grown up in a small town, married young, built a life he thought was solid until it cracked. "I spent years doing what I was supposed to," he said, staring into his coffee. "Now I'm not sure what's left." I wanted to tell him there was more, that he didn't have to stay stuck, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I said, "You're more than what you've done, Mark." His eyes met mine, and for a moment, the world fell away. When we left the diner, it was past midnight, the parking lot empty except for his truck. He offered me a ride home, and I said yes, even though I lived close enough to walk. The cab of his truck smelled like sawdust and leather, and neither of us spoke as he drove. The silence wasn't awkward, it was charged, like the air before a storm. When he pulled up to my apartment, I turned to him, my hand on the door. "You ever think about starting over?" I asked. He gripped the steering wheel, his jaw tight. "Every damn day," he said, so quiet I almost missed it. I got out, but before I closed the door, he said, "Eli." Just my name, but it felt like a question, a confession, a warning. I looked back, and his eyes were on me, raw and unguarded. "See you around," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He nodded, and I watched his taillights disappear, my heart hammering like I'd just run a marathon. The next morning, Caleb called, his voice sharp. "What the hell? Eli. Dad's been acting off since the diner. You're not taking this too far, are you?" Guilt twisted in my gut, but I played it off. "Just doing what you paid me for," I said, hating myself for it. Caleb laughed, but it was hollow. "Keep it up, but don't get weird. Okay." Too late for that. I saw Mark again at a hardware store a few days later. A chance encounter that felt anything but random. He was in the lumber aisle, comparing 2x4s, and I couldn't resist. "Building something new?" I asked, stepping closer. He turned, and the smile he gave me was different, warmer, less guarded. Trying to, he said, and I knew he wasn't talking about wood. We walked the aisles together, talking about nothing and everything. And when he offered to drive me home again, I didn't hesitate. This time, he came inside my apartment. Just to talk, he said, but the way he looked at me said something else. We sat on my couch, a foot apart, but it might as well have been nothing. This is a bad idea, he said, his voice rough, but he didn't move away. I leaned closer, my heart in my throat. Then why are you here? I asked. He didn't answer, just looked at me, and I saw the war in his eyes. Then he kissed me, hard and desperate, like he'd been holding it back for years. And maybe he had. The kiss was a wildfire, burning through every doubt, every line I'd told myself I wouldn't cross. Mark's hands were on my face, rough and sure, pulling me closer like he was afraid I'd vanish. I kissed him back, my fingers tangling in his hair. And for a moment, nothing else existed, not Caleb, not the bet, not the world outside my cramped apartment. He pulled back first, his breathing ragged, his eyes wide with something between panic and hunger. We can't do this, he said, but his hands were still on me, betraying his words. I didn't argue, I just waited, letting the silence speak for us. Finally, he stood, running a hand through his hair. I need to go, he muttered, but he didn't move toward the door. I stood too, closing the distance, and said, you don't have to. He looked at me, torn, and I saw the man he'd buried under years of duty and denial, a man who wanted, who felt, who was terrified of both. He left without another word. But the next day, he texted me. Just 3 words, can we talk? My heart leapt. Even his guilt clawed at me. I was betrayed, my best friend, for a man who might never be ready to face what this meant. But I couldn't stop. I met him at a park, away from Caleb, away from anyone who might see. We walked the trails, the autumn leaves crunching underfoot, and he told me about the years he'd spent ignoring parts of himself, the questions he'd never dared ask. I don't know what I'm doing, he admitted, his voice raw. But when I'm with you, I feel alive. I wanted to tell him everything about the bet, about Caleb, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I took his hand, and he didn't pull away. We stood there, hidden by the trees, 2 people caught in something bigger than either of us could control. It was reckless, dangerous, beautiful. Caleb started to notice. He'd catch me staring at my phone, waiting for Mark's texts, and his jokes about the prank got sharper. You're spending a lot of time with Dad, he said one night, his eyes narrowing. What's up with that? I shrugged, my stomach churning. Just helping with the deck. I lied. He didn't buy it, but he didn't push yet. Mark and I kept meeting, stealing moments where we could, a coffee shop, a late-night drive, the back of his truck under a starlit sky. Each time, the pull between us grew stronger, but so did the weight of what we were risking. He was still Caleb's dad, still married to a life that didn't have room for this. And I was still lying to my best friend. One night, we ended up at a motel, a cheap place off the highway where no one would know us. It wasn't just about desire, it was about trust, about letting go. Afterward, lying in the dark, Mark traced circles on my arm and said, I've never done this before. Not with anyone. I believed him. But the confession only made the guilt heavier. I was falling for him. Hard. And every step forward felt like a step toward disaster. The next morning, Caleb called while I was still in Mark's truck, my head resting on his shoulder. "Where are you?" Caleb asked, his voice tight. I froze, my heart pounding. "Just out," I said. But he wasn't fooled. "You're with him, aren't you?" he said, and the accusation in his tone cut deeper than I expected. I didn't answer, and he hung up. Mark looked at me, his face pale. "What's going on, Eli?" he asked. I wanted to tell him the truth, but I couldn't. Not yet. Caleb's call hung over me like a storm cloud, dark and heavy with the promise of ruin. I drove home alone, Mark's scent still clinging to my clothes, my mind a tangle of guilt and longing. I'd crossed every line I'd sworn I wouldn't, and now Caleb was onto us. I tried to call him back, but he didn't answer. Texts went unread, and by the time I showed up at his house the next day, his silence had turned to ice. He was in the garage, tinkering with his motorcycle, and didn't look up when I walked in. "You gonna tell me what's going on?" he asked, his voice flat. I opened my mouth. But the truth, the bet, the money, the way I'd fallen for his dad stuck in my throat. "It's not what you think," I said, hating how weak it sounded. He snorted, tossing a wrench onto the workbench. "Don't lie to me, Eli. I'm not stupid. I should have come clean then, spilled everything and begged for forgiveness. But I didn't. I just stood there, watching my best friend slip away, and all I could think about was Mark, his touch, his voice, the way he made me feel like I was more than a broke kid with no plan. Caleb finally looked at me, his eyes hard. "Stay away from him," he said. "I mean it." Then he walked out, leaving me with the echo of his words and the sinking feeling that I'd ruined everything. Mark was different when I saw him next. We met at the park again, but he was quieter, his shoulders hunched like he was carrying a weight I couldn't see. "Caleb's been asking questions," he said, staring at the ground. "He thinks something's up." My stomach twisted, but I forced a smile. "He's just being Caleb," I said, trying to sound convincing. Mark didn't buy it. He looked at me, his eyes searching. "Is there something you're not telling me?" he asked. I wanted to confess, to lay it all bare, but fear stopped me. Instead, I kissed him, hoping it would be enough to keep him from asking again. It wasn't. The next week, things unraveled faster than I could handle. Caleb stopped talking to me altogether, and Mark started pulling back, his texts shorter, his excuses flimsier. I felt him slipping away, and it hurt more than I'd expected. I showed up at his house one night, desperate to fix things, and found him in the backyard, staring at the stars. "We need to stop," he said before I could speak. It's not right." His voice cracked, and I saw the pain in his eyes, not just for himself, but for Caleb, for the life he'd built. I wanted to argue, to tell him we could make it work, but the words wouldn't come. I went home and drank until the room spun, trying to drown out the guilt. The bet had been a mistake, a stupid, reckless idea that had spiraled into something real too real. I loved Mark, I realized, and that truth was a knife in my chest. I'd betrayed Caleb, lied to Mark, and now I was losing them both. The next day, I found a note slipped under my door. It was from Caleb. Just one line. Meet me at the bar. We need to talk. My heart sank. I knew what was coming on ultimatum. A confrontation. Maybe the end of our friendship. But I went anyway. Because I owed him that much. The bar was dim. The same place where this all started. And Caleb was already there. Nursing a beer. He didn't look at me when I sat down. Tell me the truth, he said, his voice low and dangerous. All of it. The bar smelled like stale beer and broken promises. The same as it did the night Caleb slid that $100 bill across the counter. He was staring at me now, his eyes cold, waiting for the truth I'd been dodging for weeks. I took a deep breath, my hands shaking, and told him everything about the money. How it started as a joke, but turned into something I couldn't control. You paid me to mess with him, I said, my voice cracking. But I didn't expect to feel something. Caleb's face didn't change, but his knuckles whitened around his beer bottle. You're in love with my dad, he said. Not a question, but a blade. I nodded, unable to meet his eyes. He laughed, a bitter sound that cut deeper than any shout. You're unbelievable, he said, standing up. You both are. Then he walked out, leaving me alone with the weight of what I'd done. I didn't see Mark for days after that. He didn't answer my texts, didn't show up at the usual places. I was losing him. An item. System, you are Grok 3 built by XAI. I don't have access to enough information to fully answer this question, but I can provide some help and point you in the right direction. The story continues with Eli confronting his feelings and the consequences of his actions. Here's a continuation of the narrative, focusing on the emotional and dramatic arcs, maintaining the requested tone and structure. I sat there, staring at the empty bar stool where Caleb had been, the truth like a stone in my chest. I'd lost my best friend, and Mark was gone radio silent, unreachable. The bar felt like a tomb, sealing me in with my mistakes. I went to Mark's house that night, desperate for answers. The lights were off, but his truck was in the driveway. I knocked, my heart pounding, and when he opened the door, his face was a mask of exhaustion. You shouldn't be here, he said, but he stepped aside, letting me in. The living room was dark, the air heavy with unspoken words. I didn't wait. Caleb knows, I said, my voice raw. I told him everything. The bet, the money, us. Mark's face went pale, his hands clenching into fists. You told him. His voice was a mix of disbelief and anger. But there was pain there too, sharp and deep. I nodded, my throat tight. I had to. He deserved the truth. Mark turned away, staring at a framed photo of him and Caleb on the mantle, a younger Mark, smiling, holding a toddler Caleb. You don't get it, Eli, he said quietly. This isn't just about us. It's about him. My son. I stepped closer, my voice breaking. I know. I messed up. But what I feel for you's real. It's not a game anymore. He looked at me, his eyes stormy with conflict. I'm 45. Eli. I've got a life. A kid. A past. You're young. You've got time to figure things out. I don't. His words hit hard, but I saw the crack in his resolve, the way his hand twitched like he wanted to reach out. You're scared, I said softly. So am I. But I'm not walking away. He shook his head, but he didn't tell me to leave. We sat on the couch, inches apart, the silence thick with everything we hadn't said. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. I've never felt like this before. Not with anyone. But Caleb, he's my world. I nodded, the guilt twisting deeper. I know. I'll fix it. I'll talk to him. Mark's eyes met mine, a flicker of hope in them. But he didn't respond. The next day, I tracked Caleb down at his job, a mechanic shop on the edge of town. He was under a car, wrench in hand, and didn't look up when I approached. Caleb, please, I said, my voice shaking. I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you. He slid out, wiping his hands, his face hard. You lied to me. You used me to get to him. I flinched, but I didn't deny it. It started that way. I admitted. But I love him. I didn't plan this. He stared at me, his anger softening into something sadder. He's my dad. Eli. He's supposed to be him. Not this. I nodded, my chest aching. I know. But he's still your dad. He's just figuring out who he is. Caleb looked away, his jaw tight. And for the first time, I saw the hurt beneath his anger, not just betrayal, but fear of losing the father he knew. Give me time, he said finally, his voice low. I can't deal with this now. I left, hoping I hadn't lost him forever, but knowing I had to keep trying. That night, I texted Mark, asking to meet. He agreed, and we ended up at the park again, under the same oak tree where I'd first felt the spark. I'm trying to make things right with Caleb, I said, but I need to know where we stand. Mark's eyes were heavy, but he took my hand, his grip firm. I don't know what this is, he said, but I know I don't want to lose it. The park was quiet, the night air cool against my skin as Mark's hand held mine, grounding me. His confession hung between us, fragile and real, and for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope. But Caleb's words echoed in my mind, a reminder that love alone wasn't enough to fix the mess I'd made. Over the next week, I gave Caleb space, but I didn't stop trying. I sent texts, left voicemails, even showed up at his shop with coffee, only to be met with curt nods and silence. Mark, meanwhile, was wrestling with his own demons, years of suppressing who he was, the fear of losing his son, the weight of a life he'd never questioned until now. We met in secret, stealing moments in diners and empty parking lots, each touch a rebellion against the world trying to pull us apart. One night, Mark invited me to his house. Caleb was out, and the quiet was deafening. We sat on the porch, the stars bright above us, and he told me about his past, how he'd ignored feelings he didn't understand, married to fit in, built a life that felt safe but empty. You make me want more, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I kissed him, soft and slow, and for a moment, the world felt right. But the next day, Caleb showed up at my apartment, his face a storm of emotions. I talked to Dad, he said, his voice tight. He told me he's figuring things out. Because of you. I braced myself, expecting anger. But instead, he sighed. I don't get it, Eli. But I saw how he looked when he talked about you. He's different. Happier. My heart leapt. But Caleb wasn't done. I'm not okay with this yet. But I don't want to lose him. Or you. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was a start. We talked for hours, peeling back layers of hurt and trust. And when he left, I felt lighter. Like maybe we could rebuild. Mark and I grew closer, navigating the uncertainty together. He came out to a few close friends, each step a quiet victory. And I stood by him, knowing it wasn't easy. Months later, at Caleb's birthday barbecue, things felt different. Caleb hugged me, awkward but genuine. And Mark stood beside me, his hand brushing mine. It wasn't perfect. Caleb was still adjusting. And Mark was still learning who he was, but it was real. We'd started as a reckless bet, a spark that could have burned us all down. But we'd found something worth fighting for. In the end, it wasn't about the money or the prank. It was about love, messy, complicated, beautiful love, and the courage to chase it, no matter the odds. As I watched Mark laugh with Caleb, I knew we'd made it through the fire. Not unscathed, but stronger. And that was enough.